I'm going to talk about this book, Empire of Borders. It just came out 2 months ago now, and I'm been going around different parts of at first southern Arizona where I live. I live in Tucson, Arizona, but now expanding past there into the rest of the country and giving talks about this book. And while I've been doing that, I've been trying to figure out how to, tell the story of this book and when it, and in doing so, I've wondered, when did I actually begin writing this book? And it occurred to me, well, at first I thought it was 2015 because that would be the obvious starting point because that's when I discussed doing this book with a publisher and actually signed to do that. But I realized that it was before then, or probably 5 years before then. In 2000, I go back to the story of 2010 because in 2010 I was commissioned by NACLA, a publication that looks at Latin America, um, to write a story about what was happening in Haiti after the earthquake. And if you remember, in 2010, the earthquake in Haiti was devastating. I think it was over 200,000 people were killed, a million people displaced, and I started. So when I did that story, my thoughts of the border were, very much fixated on the U.S. Mexico border, right? The U.S. that so that's where I was thinking the U.S. Mexico border was almost automatically my thought. The fortifications, the post 9/11 fortifications have been happening there, and so when I did this story, one of the first things I found was not an immigration story at all. It was a border story. And for example, 5 days after the earthquake, a jumbo jet it was a United States aid mission, but in that aid mission, they sent a jumbo jet over Haiti with a pre-recorded voice of the ambassador of Haiti, um, telling people not to leave. That don't leave. If you leave, you'll be interdicted, and you'll be stopped and returned back to Haiti. Um, and that was backed up by 16 Coast Guard cutters or the ships that came up right up to the Haitian coast. Um, and that was further backed up by Geo Group. Geo Group is the private prison company that does immigration detention as well. Well, they cleared up bed space in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, just in case people started to leave. And so the story turned into a border story, right? At the time, people were just trying to get their lives back together, so there wasn't many people actually leaving the island. Perhaps later that would happen, but what was startling to me was like, wow, this is the U.S. border, right? The U.S. border um, is elastic, right? It came off of the main. No, Haiti's what, 1,000 miles away from the mainland U.S. It was elastic. It went all the way to the Haitian shore. It was enacted very quickly, and in all of its components, with the enforcement, the PR, the enforcement, and the incarceration parts of it. Um, Another story that also in the Caribbean that that I think was very key in leading to this particular book was I went to the west coast of Puerto Rico in 2012 to Aguadilla. Aguadilla is a place where there was a U.S. naval base, but then it was turned into a um, I would call a homeland security base, meaning that there's a border patrol station there. There's one, if you look at the border patrol sectors, the U.S. border patrol sectors are throughout the mainland, and there's one that's outside of the mainland, and it's in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and it's based in Aguadilla. And so I went there, and first of all, being being from Arizona, seeing the green stripe border patrol vehicles, patrolling the west coast of Puerto Rico was very eye opening. Considering I had them geographically placed in another area altogether, um, and so that was one thing. But the story I want to share is I interviewed a park ranger from the Mona Island, and the reason why they were on the border patrol was on the west coast is because it overlooks the Mona Strait. And if you think about the Mona Strait and the geography of it, across the Mona Strait is the Dominican Republic. Um, the Mona Island is actually closer to the Dominican Republic than Puerto Rico. It's like 30 miles away from the DR. And the park ranger told me this story that just happened right before I got there. And it was a boat, a ship of people, Haitians, were going by the Mona Island, no intention of going to the Mona Island, no intention of going to Puerto Rico, going to another place altogether. But the ship crashed. It crashed, and it started sinking. So the people on the ship jumped off the ship and started running onto the Mona Island. Of course, there it was. They were running literally right into the U.S. border, right? So the park rangers were already deputized by the U.S. Border Patrol to do immigration enforcement. So what happened was that they checked people, their papers. They didn't have proper papers to be in the United States, and then they were detained. And then the U.S. Border Patrol came, brought them back to Aguadilla in Puerto Rico, incarcerated them, and then formally deported them back to Haiti. So those are a couple of the stories that, wow, that really formed a foundation leading into writing this book. And one final story I wanted to mention, and this actually happened after I signed to write this book, was in Guatemala, and it was Zacapa. Zacapa is in the borderlands with Honduras, and I was on a research trip, but I was going to a bunch of places. So I was actually in San Pedro Sula, and I had a interview set up with the commander of a new border patrol in Guatemala called the Torti. What I wanted to do was go and interview the commander and really, confirm that the Torti was almost, maybe essentially a creation of the United States. That's what I wanted to find out, right? Or what degree the United States had been behind the creation of this new border patrol in Guatemala. And but I was 2 hours late because I miscalculated that there were no buses at night in Honduras, for example, and then I miscalculated how long it takes to get across the border. And I got there 2 hours late, and so I talked to the soldiers at the gate and who I asked, can I still get the meeting with this commander? And they started making phone calls, and the next thing I knew, a soldier approached me and he asked me, "Are you from Bortak?" And I was like, "What? Bortak?" And like, who here has heard of Bortak? You've heard of him. So most people have not heard of, most people have not heard of Bortak, right? Bortak, most people in the United States, if you go like into like asking a random person who Bortak is, most likely is they're not going to know it. Bortak is the tactical unit of the U.S. Border Patrol. They do SWAT style operations in the U.S. border regions, but one of their missions is to do international trainings. And so there it was, confirmed to me that Bortak, the U.S. Border Patrol, had stood there in those very gates, probably talked to that very soldier. And I think it was in that moment that I realized the magnitude of what I was looking into, that this was big, much bigger than I even thought it was before, even when I was those other experiences, like how vast it was, how extensive it was. The command, like I did get the meeting with the commander. The commander immediately confirmed. He said, we are a creation of the U.S. Embassy. That's what he told me. And there was 3 months of training. That was the very first year. And of course, Bortak and Border Patrol and other Customs and Border Protection have been there to do the training, among other people from the U.S. military. And so, yeah. So the magnitude of it was becoming apparent, and it shouldn't have been a surprise, because if you look at, say, like the 9/11 Commission report from 2003, for example, it says one of the key quotes, and it's 1,000 pages long, but one key quote in there is they say the American homeland is the planet. So what is that? What is that? Or you can look at some of the quotes from Alan Burson. Alan Burson was a border czar under the Clinton administration. He was a former Customs and Border Protection Commissioner, and he was an assistant secretary of the Department of Homeland Security for the International Affairs Department when he said in 2012 that our southern border is no longer the border with the United States of Mexico. It's now the border between Chiapas and Guatemala. Alan Burson also said that that in the post 9/11 era, this kind of shift to, it's not a shift, it's an addition as far as border policing to this international externalization of the border was a quote unquote massive paradigm change. And when I interviewed people in Washington as part of this International Affairs Department for Customs and Border Protection, and I asked one of the officials to use one word to explain how much this has grown since 9/11. He said exponentially. And to give you a quote about what it, so if you could look up, if you look pushing out the borders, the border is our last line of defense, not first line of defense. A number of CBP commissioners, you can see how prevalent the strategy is. I want to read one quote though. It's from John Kelly, who is, of course, the first Secretary of Homeland Security under the Donald Trump administration. During his confirmation hearing, he said this. He said, border security cannot be attempted as an endless series of goal line stands on the 1 foot line at the ports of entry or along the thousands of miles of border between this country and Mexico. I believe the defense of the southwest border starts 1,500 miles to the south with Peru. And yeah, so even in John Kelly's rendition, the investigations that I've done, it's much even further than the Western Hemisphere. It goes even further than Peru. There's for example, there's 23 attaches, Customs and Border Protection attaches, one that began in 2003. The first one was in Mexico City, but expanded Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, Nairobi, Kenya, Tokyo, Japan. There's all kinds of programs that, so one of the things about foreign assistance is that only the Department of Defense or Department of State can do foreign assistance. So Department of Homeland Security cannot do foreign assistance. But now there's nearly 100 programs through which Department of Homeland Security can get money and resources from the Department of State and Department of Defense to funnel into border programs in what became quite apparent more than 100 countries. Like if I were to shut my eyes and go like that, most likely wherever I place my finger would be a country. In that case, Brazil, and there's definitely programs in Brazil, and there's a CBP attaché in Brazil, and there's programs on various borders in Brazil. And so, yeah, so this is what I did with this book. I followed. I of course, when you have 100 countries, you can't go to all 100 countries. But what I tried to do was go to different countries to show what was happening, how it was happening, where it was happening, and to what degree it was happening. And so I went to, well, I'll tell you, one place I went to, or how it works. How does it work? One example of how it works is that Customs and Border Protection puts together teams, assessment teams, partly with BORTAC or Border Patrol agents, other Customs and Border Protection agents, and they go to different countries and they do assessments. One example of that would be 2006 in the Dominican Republic, where an assessment team from CBP went. They looked at the Dominican-Haiti border. They decided that it was porous, that Dominican Republic should start its own border patrol. And lo and behold, in 2007, by presidential decree, the Dominican Republic said we're going to start our own border patrol. And so I went to the Dominican Republic in 2012, and there's many stories I can tell about that. But one of the one of the things that was quite striking was how, like, seeing the border patrol in Dajabon. They're called CESFRONT. They're in Dajabon, um, lined up on the Massacre River in front of Haiti, and deployed, and very similarly to U.S. Border Patrol agents on the Nogales, like sitting their axes. One would be on one, sitting on one, one agent or soldier would be watching one part of the border, and then an eighth of a mile there'd be another one, and another one, and another one. The whole idea of blockading the border, actually following quite in suit with the prevention through deterrence strategy you see on the U.S. southern border, where cities and traditional crossing places have been blockaded, so people then circumvent those areas into um, uh, places that are supposed to be natural deterrents, such as the desert, where many people, of course, have died crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. So it was very similar in the Dominican Republic. What a trainer told me was that the assessment teams go and they do diagnostics. They do, like, it's like a prescription, and then the country follows that prescription. And seemingly, the Dominican Republic was following that prescription, but it manifests its way in many different places. Kenya, around that time, also, it not limited to the Caribbean, not limited to Latin America. Kenya formed its own border patrol in 2010. It's called the Rural Border Patrol, among many other things. The Philippines, uh, these are places that I went to. The Philippines, where would be a border in a 7,000 island nation state? Well, it's a maritime domain. 20. One thing I witnessed there was a $20 million construction of what's called the National Coastal Watch Center, which is constructed by the Raytheon Corporation through a contract, and mainly to look over, like, the border, the maritime borderlands of the Philippines. Speaking of Raytheon, Raytheon also had a contract in Jordan to the tune of about $300 million, where they're developing a border system, and this is also U.S. mainly U.S. funded, between Jordan and Syria, and Jordan and Iraq. Um, I mean, the Raytheon element is also something I look into as well. Raytheon is but one company in many companies that are getting border contracts, both domestically in the United States and around the world. Um, and so, um, just to finish, because I know our time is limited here. Uh, when I mean, I followed in the book. I followed this. I just really followed the money. I followed the money. I followed where it was going. How was it manifesting? What did it look like? Why? And of course, and I went through looking at the United States through the lens of the United States. But of course, the U.S. isn't um, the only country that does this, right? The European Union is very much what they call externalizing their borders and putting lots of money into what they call their buffer countries, which is Turkey, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, and Australia has been involved in, extending its borders. And I want to finish by, like, there was I went as part of the research to what was called the International Summit on Borders. It was put on by Customs and Border Protection in Washington, and it brought in countries, like maybe representatives from maybe 40 or 30 or 40 countries from around the world. And there's many things. There's a lot of talk about international partnerships, harmonizing the border systems, right? So each country is kind of in harmony with each other. And but the one thing that really I want to stress was this was a keynote that was given by the head of the Department of Homeland Security from Australia, and he began his keynote um, by saying, when globalization started, when, after the Cold War, right, in the late 1990s or the early 1990s, late 1980s, when we thought the new world order that he began by saying we thought that prosperity was going to fill out to the edges, and of course what he was talking about was, well, now the advent of free market capitalism and the free market model, right, and how it was supposed to bring prosperity to all, and but his discourse went, we didn't realize that there would be misery, right? The misery that would be, we didn't figure out like that how much misery there would be, and I think about that, and I think about in like when you think about it in a more specific sense, you can think about the North American Free Trade Agreement and how it's like particularly manifested. And there was the incident of Doris Meisner, who was the Immigration and Naturalization Commissioner, who stood before U.S. Congress in 1992 and said, with NAFTA, when NAFTA is implemented in 1994, we're going to see, immigration. We're going to see an upsurge of immigration from Mexico, and this whole idea of hardening the U.S. borders, and which would translate into Operation Hold the Line, Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Safeguard, Operation Rio Grande Valley South. That the U.S. would have to harden its borders in response to this. So this kind of awareness that the kind of free market model, the opening of borders for a certain, allowing and grain, like for example, U.S. grain movers to compete with small farmers in Mexico who no longer were making subsidies, right, or no longer had a guaranteed price, was going to cause upheavals, and then the response was build up the border, right, and that's so. So I would say that there was an awareness, but the director of Homeland Security from Australia was, no, we didn't realize. And so he's probably talking about like some of the vast inequalities we've seen in the world in the last 25 years. He's probably might have been talking about also the impacts of climate change that are seen more and more prominently in many, many different places, causing already displacement and projected to cause more displacement. And like thinking about, while he was talking, and simultaneously talking about the harmonization of the border system, even talked about possibly dissolving the nation, like reconfiguring what the nation state is. But his whole thing was, we have to consider the border system as an international border system. And when you think of it rather than one country, but in an international sense, and this is the last thing I'll leave it with before we go into discussion, then it becomes, instead of like the 650-mile border wall and barrier on the U.S.-Mexico border, it becomes what it is globally. It becomes a global system of, now there's 77 border walls around the world. Now there's countless billions of dollars of technologies being deployed along these border walls. Now there's probably hundreds of thousands of armed agents that are deployed in these jagged lines that, if you look at them, and this might be a little simplistic, but if you look at them, they're put between what we look as the global north and the global south. And that was one of the biggest revelations that I came from it with this book, is that when you look at the totality of it, and the international harmonization, and then it's like, wow, there's a whole big global border system. That as a last word before we have some questions, is that just because there's a lot of people also very much resisting that in many different ways in many different places around the world. What? Oh, whatever. Yeah, go for it.
So yesterday we had the former Mexican consul and the former U.S. ambassador to Mexico talking about how Trump's immigration regime impacts U.S.-Mexican relations. And really what they were talking about is that the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico has really been brought down to that whole internal militarization of the border on behalf of the Mexican troops, sort of both the north and south, and kind of refer a little bit to this kind of the new government of Mexico, which ran under a somewhat progressive stance, which has made the deal with the devil. But because all this money is coming through for internal immigration enforcement and border militarization north and south within Mexico, it has taken that focus off any other kind of aid to actually address the root causes of the migration in the first place. So now the Mexican military infrastructure is responsible for looking for Guatemalans and Salvadorans and deporting them from Mexico versus letting them get to the US border. So if you look at this bigger picture, sort of you're looking at global north, global south, what do you see as any aspect of US foreign policy that is actually focused on addressing the causes of migration?
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a little bits of aid here and there. I mean, most of the U.S. policy, like what I almost see as the U.S. policy addressing migration is just like looking at this border buildup, because that's how the U.S. seems to be primarily addressing migration. And there's probably aid projects here and there. I know that there's been climate adaptation projects and that sort of thing in different communities, but the vast amount of money seems to be going to whether it's in the United States, like what is it, $24 billion this year to border and immigration enforcement, or the money that's being funneled into Mexico, which of course predated the Trump administration. Mexico's been deporting more people from Central America, and the trend had been the U.S. And then in 2015, after the Frontera Sur program was announced in Mexico, it started in 2014, 2015, Mexico started have deported more people, Central American, I should say, people from Mexico than the United States deported Central American people. And it's been that case since then. And then, of course, the Trump administration, like you just mentioned, and with the cooperation of the Lopez Obrador administration in Mexico, has ratcheted up even more, but following the pattern that was already set. So I mean, I just see like whatever, like looking at US aid, of course you have to like dissect what it exactly is and what is its intentions and what it's doing. But it seems like disproportionately the migration plan has been to build up more walls. And one thing says it all to me, like when you look at the DHS climate adaptation papers, they really like point to the droughts in Central America. They say there's a drought happening in, more and more droughts are happening in Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras, but now we might have to prepare our borders for mass migrations instead of. That's the kind of automatic mentality. You'd suspect it from DHS, right? Because that's their mission, but that's where most of the money is going.
Hi, firstly, thank you for coming out today and for sharing your wisdom. So my question is, to what extent has the U.S. xenophobia affected anti-immigrant sentiment in Latin America, in countries like Mexico, where 64% of Mexicans view Central American migrants as economic burdens for Mexicans? And if, according to your opinion, should the U.S. be kept accountable for this? If so, how?
Yeah, I don't. That's yeah. I didn't. It's hard to quantify, like in terms of how a message of xenophobia, which is, as we know, is very apparent here in the United States, right? Especially with the Trump administration in terms of like building up border enforcement. But it's hard to say how much. Like, I don't know how you quantify how that would translate into Mexico, for example, and though I think so it'd be hard. It's hard for me to like say I don't know, that how much to establish like that directly comes from the United States, which as you say, I'm sure it probably does, but it's hard to quantify that. And that's I didn't even know those statistics that you just raised are that's pretty significant. I mean, I think that's really where maybe that's a really something as a student. Maybe I'd be really interested to see what you might come up with if you were to look into that more and see like where does that come from? Where are people getting those ideas from? And given the U.S. Mexico cooperation, I would imagine that you're onto something by suspecting that this might be coming a lot from the United States. Yeah.
You have a really stunning example in your book, Border Patrol Nation, about how President Nixon's wife, and I'm blanking on her name, basically crosses the U.S.-Mexico border and says, "We hope this wall won't be here for long." And you kind of trace that to the change now, where kind of on all sides of the political spectrum, the idea that we have to have a strong border has just become kind of a foregone accepted conclusion. Can you talk more about why this is the case and why there's been such a shift kind of in the discourse? Is it mostly because of 9/11? Is it mostly because there's kind of these really powerful security companies that have maybe been able to lobby congressional representatives? Like, what are kind of the main reasons for the shift?
Yeah, I think again we're talking about lots of public relations. There's a book called Operation Gatekeeper or Operation Gatekeeper and Beyond by geographer Joseph Nevins, who goes in. That's where I got that story from to begin with about Pat Nixon. Is the first lady, right? The wife of Richard Nixon, and I believe that was in 1971. And the Secret Service cut the fence that separated Mexico from the United States, and she just walked across. And really, yeah, like I would suggest like looking into because he goes pretty in depthly into like a lot of like how reporting on borders and immigration shifted and then by the time there was 1990s operations. If you look at the State of the Union address in 1995 by Bill Clinton, he gives it's almost like there's a parts of it where, of course, he's not Trump, but he sounds like Donald Trump in the way that he's describing how the he's like, we don't want illegal immigration. I think he says illegal aliens. He says words like that and really emphasizes how much his administration is building up the borders, which they were. There was a number of operations during the Clinton years that were the gatekeeper, hold the line, and so throughout the Clinton years, you had all these operations, and then the president himself, saying this. So you already see the shift from when Pat Nixon to the Bill Clinton, and then you have the post 9/11, and the 9/11 really also just shifted so many things. What 9/11 did to the borders, and border is like, again, you can't think of just the U.S. Mexico border, right? And the border here was really really impacted by in the post 9/11 era, and just the rhetoric of you had that rhetoric of counterterrorism, you had that rhetoric of a criminal element coming across the border, and all these sorts of things, and somewhere along the lines, the idea of border security, like which has been repeated and repeated, it just became something that was never unpacked, that you just could say that everyone would agree on, that we need border security, and then and then if you look at in the past 25 years, the budgets for border and immigration enforcement, they've gone up and up and up and up and up and up and up with very little public debate. $1.5 billion in 1994 was the annual budget for border and immigration enforcement. Over $23 billion if you take CBP and ICE together in 2018. So it's gone up really significantly without much pushback, but we are starting to see pushback now with the Trump administration, which is interesting. Are you keeping track of the question people ask?
We had one question here, and I think that's probably going to be our last.
There's one other.
Eddie also.
Okay.
We'll take those two at once.
I'll try to be brief.
Well, you mentioned that there were other actors like the EU were also doing something like
Yeah.
the US, but you also characterized it as kind of like this harmonization between the global north and the global south. So I was wondering what specific like policies that the EU has been doing may mirror or be different from the ways in which the US has been doing this, and like what the differences or what ways they're the same.
Let's take this last question in the back end.
Hi, I am very pleased to be here. My name is Elisa and I am from the south of Mexico, from Chiapas. I like very much that you talk about NAFTA and how from this free trade agreement, more people start migrating to the US. And I think this perhaps was the second biggest wave beside of the Brazil program that started migrating to this country. My question is, because there is a new free trade agreement going on, and this free trade agreement between Canada, US, and Mexico is still ignoring the mobilization or displacement that these agreements are causing in our countries. And my question would be like, do you, and what concerns me more because we see this bunch of people crossing Mexico from Central America, and I mean we understand they are having a difficult time also in the country, and they don't want to stay there because they are also suffering from a lot of violence, which is related to there's no jobs, there's no opportunities, and I don't see any dialogue happening from our governments, including the countries of Central America. So I don't know what would you suggest or what would be your thoughts in this, in how this relationship or this conversation could start from our governments that they take into account these free trade agreements and to be more inclusive with Central America, because it is clear that the main wave of migration is coming from Central America and it's not been taken account again. So I don't know what you think about this.
Thanks. All right, so I'll take your question, then your question. The European Union is I would say that's their main policy, more than they call it. The kind of upsurge of border fortifications in the European Union, and that's around the perimeter, not in the Schengen area, but in the around. If you follow the budgets in Europe, they've been increasing significantly over, again, in the post 9/11 era. You're just seeing lots of more money going to it, but a huge part of it is this giving money to Turkey, and the European Union, it seems like it's the countries that are very much close to it. They call them the buffer countries, which is, I don't agree with that term, but that's like the idea that Turkey becomes a border because Syria, Turkey, Greece, right? And so put a lot of money into Turkey, and then Turkey builds up they build a border wall. They have drones patrolling the border wall. Libya, like if you go and look at Libya and you follow the EU money going to Libya, it's significant. And if you hear the horror stories that are coming for people crossing through Libya, seeing that's become a border escape. U.S. money is going to Libya as well. U.S. money is going to Turkey as well. So you have this kind of harmonization between the EU and the United States and the countries, right? The countries, like, where from an elite level, at least from the government, they're like, Turkey is agreeing to do this, right? Morocco is agreeing, Mexico is agreeing to do it from a governmental level. So that's like when they talk about the harmonization, it's like all these like borders are going to be like pretty harmonized, and what I think they mean is that the people who are displaced, like the people that are displaced due to free trade agreements, for example, are the ones that are going to nail the ones that are going to hit these borders wherever they go. And that's it's not there yet, but that's what it seems like, at least what you can deduce from what people are saying. And I think like what your points are really strong, and I think there's like the new NAFTA. I forget what the exact name of it is. NAFTA 2, I think it's called. I don't even know if it's going to actually. I mean, it has to be ratified, and there's a huge long process. But if there's not, I mean, you look at it and it's like there's really it's even worse. Or I mean, it favors. I mean, the thing about NAFTA 1, it was written by 500 corporations, and NAFTA 2 is with a few reforms is very similar. And I mean, I know that there's some modifications, and CAFTA, which is Central America Free Trade Agreement, which is rarely talked about. It's like NAFTA for Central America, right? And that this some of the stats are coming in. You know, like I think Honduras was an exporter of corn, but now they're an importer of corn, like within a 6-year period, meaning that like the small farmers in Honduras are getting nailed like the small farmers in Mexico. Um, and and those ideas of like free market or free trade are no, they're not even on the table, right? It's like one it's like one thing is one the borders are being completely opened up for. I just interviewed. This will be the last thing I say because I know, but I just interviewed a woman from Honduras who came. She was in detention in Eloy, Arizona, for 10 months, and she just got released. But the reason why she left was because there's a mining company in her community in Copan, near Copan, um, and her family and other people in the community, about 300 people in the community, had organized an environmental group. So if you're thinking of Berta Cáceres or environmental activism, here's another example. And they so they've been showing like all kinds of damage done to their community, the cyanide in the water, cyanide in people's blood, uh, excessive levels of lead in both the water and people's blood. And um, and then the last straw was now the mining company, which is a Canadian company, wants to excavate their cemetery. So her grandparents, her great grandparents are in that cemetery, and so they're like, no. And there's been payoffs to, so some people have taken the payoffs and they're for the excavation, and other people are. So there's a whole long story, but it comes down to this. That's one mining company of hundreds and hundreds of mining companies that are all throughout Latin America that have come through the open border policy of that comes with NAFTA and CAFTA, right? And then set up shop. There's no immigration apparatus stopping them. There's no border patrol. There's no ICE rounding up the companies when they poison the water supplies. The mining uses tons of water, so the water sources have dried up. Like 16 water sources have dried up. So they have a water problem, and it's contaminated. And then because they did protests. Actually, they took over the cemetery, tried to blockade the cemetery so the mining company wouldn't go in. Um, her and her family and other community members that have been doing this started getting threats, and she got including death threats multiple times through many ways, text messages, phone calls, and finally she left. That's why she left. That was she felt her life and her children's life were threatened through this whole thing with the mine, and it was all like the root of it was a mine. And she actually just, it wasn't an asylum, but she was released. So she has this long story of coming from Honduras, being uh, detained in Mexico, deported back to Honduras, coming again, like months and months just to get to the United States. And she came under the border wall in Yuma and turned herself in, and then went to Eloy, and she was there for 8 months or 9 months. And then where I interviewed her was 2 days ago in Mineola, Long Island, where her family. So, I mean, that's an example. I think that's a really good personal example of one person's. But with that, I probably have to stop talking, right?